I don't think of OnDeck as an accelerator at all. An accelerator is really something that you do when you want to grow something that already exists. So usually you have a co-founder, usually you have an idea, usually you might even have a product with a couple of users and paying customers. And the idea of an accelerator is to accelerate all that. Luck is an interesting word, and an interesting idea. Luck sometimes has to do with being in the right place at the right time. But I don't think that anybody is, there is some luck in the sense that, when people are born, where they're born, sort of the things that they have going for them that are kind of outside of their control. But there are plenty of people who completely flub it, even if they have all of the best things going for them, right? They have all the advantages in the world. And there are people who are ridiculously successful, even though they had everything, all of the cards stacked against them, right? I think that great ideas can come from, a couple of things. It can come from something that you already had before you decided to start a company. They could also come from the process of going out there and talking to customers and sort of like exploring and sort of having design partners. The network is a very ambiguous term. The way I would describe building your network is in a couple of areas. The first is that it's...
Thank you so much to Dula for being the early backer of the podcast. For entrepreneurs and founders just starting out, forming a US LLC, a bank account, managing taxes, compliance can be a daunting task. If you're a non-US resident or a first-time founder who lacks the experience, knowledge to navigate the complex legal and financial landscape, it will be impossible for you to do all this. Dula is an all-in-one platform that simplifies the process of forming a US LLC, setting up a US bank account, and handling taxes, compliance for startups and businesses all over the world. Dula's mission is to democratize access to the US market and empower entrepreneurs to focus on building their businesses without getting bogged down by bureaucracy. If you're building a company, there's no better option out there than Dula.com.
Hey Julian, how are you? Hope you're doing well.
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, same here. I think so. Before we get with just who is Julian? Who are you?
Yeah, I am Julian. I'm a co-founder and now CEO of a company called OnDeck. What we're really known for is a program called ODF. And ODF is focused on helping more people start the best companies. And we do that a number of ways. But the main one is by bringing exceptionally talented people together at a stage when they're trying to figure a lot of things out still. They're trying to figure out who might they start their company with, what might they build, who might their initial customers be, how might they go about acquiring those customers, all of those things that we describe as missing pieces. That's kind of what we're focused on. I've been doing OnDeck and ODF for about 5 years now. Prior to that, I had founded another company that was in the nutrition and healthcare space. And prior to that, I went to music school. So I have a pretty unorthodox path into tech. And, I think that for me, the thing that I gain the most satisfaction in is helping people who are really ambitious, who really care about something that they're, some space or opportunity that they're excited about, giving them the opportunity to go and build something special and help them maybe unblock or find the things that they need to actually be successful.
Would you categorize OnDeck as a mini accelerator? Sir?
I would describe OnDeck as maybe a pre-accelerator, meaning I don't think of OnDeck as an accelerator at all. An accelerator is really something that you do when you want to grow something that already exists. So usually you have a co-founder, usually you have an idea, usually you might even have a product with a couple of users and paying customers. And the idea of an accelerator is to accelerate all that, right? To make it grow, to work towards sort of an inflection point, and in which case, typically, traditionally, you fundraise, right? You go and raise money from investors, and usually that's the first time you fundraise, but you fundraise many times after that. With what we do at ODF, we actually help you when you don't have any of those things. There's nothing to accelerate. There usually isn't a company yet. The company hasn't been incorporated. There's just nothing has been figured out for the most part, other than the inclination that, hey, I might want to start a company right now. I wonder who I might do that with, and I wonder what we might build together.
But if we really look at it that way, then do real companies really get formed when people sit down and ideate on what they want to build versus there's a problem that they feel around them and they just go head down for solving?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that, a lot of great companies are started from an insight that somebody has that, is unique insight that's sort of related to their personal experiences. But oftentimes the things that people start with are not the things that they end up with. There are plenty of companies that have gone through ODF that are now quite successful, where they started with an idea that was completely unrelated to what they're building today and what is successful today. Two of the companies, I actually just had one of them on my own podcast recently, which is called Shepherd. And Shepherd essentially is, building insurance for construction firms. Now, they started off building all sorts of things, including in the creator economy. But now they're essentially an insurance company for construction, and then maybe they'll move into agriculture and all these other areas. They tried to do things in areas that maybe weren't necessarily ones that they had a specific edge in or a specific insight in, but they were just interested in, and sort of they were kind of popular spaces at the time. But ultimately, they ended up realizing that they did have an insight in construction, but it wasn't like they went directly there. Usually it's much more of a zigzag before you end up there. And then, of course, there are other companies that there is much more of like, okay, I'm starting the company with a clear intention, a clear idea. And those companies could be great too. I'd say that there's sometimes a little bit fewer and far between, in the sense that it's usually hard to immediately nail the exact thing that you want to build in the early days.
What really then differentiates between companies that are built on top of insights versus built on top of ideas in general that people ideate?
I think all companies are built on top of insights. The question is really more of is the insight something that is the precursor to the company getting started, or is the insight something that's discovered along the way, right? So for the example of Shepherd, which is doing the construction insurance, they didn't have that as the first thing that they worked on, but they eventually came to this realization that, hey, maybe we should play to something that's one of our strengths. Maybe we should look at some of our past experiences and how they might inform potential problems that we could go after. The CEO and co-founder Justin, he had built some construction software in the past. He'd worked with construction companies. He understood a little bit about the problems related to insurance there. So there were some insights that he was able to develop based off of that. And then, of course, there are sometimes people where they have that insight, and that's the basis of starting the company. Celine Haliwa, who is building a dog longevity company. She's trying to make it so that dogs could live longer, healthier lives. And then hopefully that will apply to humans as well. She started with this insight and this interest in dog longevity. And I know that she said in the past that she specifically would not necessarily have started a company unless she felt that was the best way to accomplish the goal. So it wasn't even necessarily about, hey, I want to go and start a company. In her case, it was, I want to accomplish this goal of longevity. And it seems like the best way to accomplish that is through building a company.
What other ways is there rather than building?
Well, I mean, in terms of research, there's probably working with universities and labs. There's working with larger drug developers and larger companies. And I'd say that that's actually probably, I said that that's for drugs and biotech, but it's probably true in general for other things. There's probably some places where you could actually contribute more to a certain field or a certain area of progress when you're a part of a larger organization than a small one. There's this idea of extending innovation, which a bunch of people kind of believe that AI is an extending innovation, meaning it's something that will benefit the incumbents more than it will benefit new upstarts. So, for instance, they think that Microsoft is better poised to be successful than some new startup. When it comes to utilizing AI and And I think that there are a lot of reasons for this, cost being a primary one. But, the general idea is like, okay, if you think that like there's an innovation that's an extending innovation, the best thing you could do if you really want to contribute to that field might be to go and work at one of those larger organizations. And I say might be, and that should be emphasized because, I think that there's truly something special about, building something from scratch. I also think that some people who are good at building things from scratch would not do well in a larger organization. So it might be a bit of a false choice. Some people obviously can do really well in a large organization and would absolutely, falter if they tried to build something, as a startup. So I think that both of those cases can be true. But yeah, I don't think that you necessarily need to start a startup to have an impact on the world, though I think it's probably one of the best ways to have an impact if you're successful.
How should people really know whether they can have a lot of impact at a startup or after working?
The chance of your small startup having an impact in any meaningful way for any meaningful number of people is quite low. But the chance of you having an impact in any meaningful way as an individual at a large company is also quite low. So I think that, at the end of the day, the odds are having this like absolutely large impact on either side of the spectrum, like as you as an individual, are not particularly great. And if that's the case, then why not control your own destiny fully and build your own thing, right? Because if you're doing this at a bigger company, the challenge with that is that you actually don't get to control really how much impact that you have in the world, because you're so dependent on permission from other people, from budgets getting approved, all these different sort of machinations inside of a large organization, that it kind of like removes a lot of the agency from you for being able to actually have the impact that you might want to have. Whereas with a startup, again, extremely difficult. Likelihood of success is very low, but at the end of the day, it really is all up to you. And, people will say it's about, it's about luck, and people will say it's about who you know, and all of these different things. I think that both of those are partially true, but I think at the end of the day, it's really like, do you give up? And are you resourceful? If you don't give up, and you're working towards something that actually has promise, and you're really resourceful, then I think that it really just matters about how much time you have to like dedicate to it and how long you work at it before you give up. And I think that's sort of the thing that people miss out on. Like if you're going in the wrong direction for too long of a time, you're going to burn out, you're going to lose hope, and you probably should quit. Like at least quit working on that if you're going in the wrong direction for too long. But otherwise, generally speaking, your biggest constraints are whether or not you actually keep going and whether or not you're resourceful.
How much of it is really, how much of luck is really involved from what you've seen?
Well, luck is an interesting word, and an interesting idea. Luck sometimes has to do with being in the right place at the right time. But I don't think that anybody is, there is some luck in the sense that, when people are born, where they're born, sort of the things that they have going for them that are kind of outside of their control. But there are plenty of people who completely flub it, even if they have all of the best things going for them, right? They have all the advantages of the world. And there are people who are ridiculously successful, even though they had everything, all of the cards stacked against them, right? I think that ultimately the way I think about luck is that luck is sort of an amplifier of outcomes, in the sense that, it's almost like, think about like a wave, right? If you're paddling and you're paddling and you're paddling on a surfboard, well, you might catch some small waves, but you might actually just end up being there when you have this really great chance where you're at just the right point and you're paddling at just the right speed and you catch this wave. This wave is just an incredible wave. It's a wave that sustains and goes for a really long period of time. And that wave is one that you can surf, and it's just so smooth, right? And obviously no startup is smooth, but this idea of like that you're so lucky to have been there for that wave, right? Well, think about all the things that required you to be out there in that wave in the first place, right? You needed to wake up in the morning, decide that you were going to go surfing, go out there, pack up your car, or put your surfboard on your bicycle, bike down or drive down to the water, decide that like you're going to go out there and paddle even though it's cold out, it's not particularly the best weather. You get out there, the waves there's no waves, it's flat, right? But you hang out there and you're waiting around and you're kind of trying to position yourself, and then you're paddling and you're trying to catch other waves, right? And maybe you catch a few small ones along the way. But then eventually you're out there long enough and you're trying long enough that eventually that big wave comes and you're really well positioned. I think serendipity is similar to luck, but I think it's a certain kind of luck, and I think it's partially increasing the surface area, but I think it's also just like you have to be in the game to win, right? And you have to be in the game long enough to win. But if you truly believe that it's going to take 3 months to become successful, that is probably going to be bad. Sometimes if you're tired and you don't want to work out, right, the best thing that you could do is say, oh, I'm just going to do like 5 squats, right? Or I'm just going to run a mile, right? But inevitably, once you actually put your running shoes on or you start to work out, you can do more than that basic thing. So I think that like if you think about it from that as sort of like a mental hack to get moving, like, oh, I'm just going to try it for 3 months, like that's fine. You just don't want to think about it like legitimately as that way. Like I expect this is going to have success in 3 months.
The people who really sticked around after the 3 months, what do you think differentiates them versus what they are building versus people who went back to school or did what they wanted to do after?
I think it's pretty clear pretty quickly whether or not somebody actually cares about sticking with something, or if they're just doing it because they think it's the cool thing to do, or they feel like obliged to do it. I was talking to Sasha Orloff, who is from ODF 8. He's now the founder and CEO of a company called Puzzle. And he was saying, he described it as founders in name only, essentially meaning they're founders who, are more like trying to call themselves founders, but they don't actually really want to do all of the work associated with it because they think that founder is sort of like a good title or something. I think that generally a lot of people think the idea of starting a company is really good, and then they realize just how hard it is and just how painful it is, and just frankly how it's not for everyone. I mean, like, my personal belief is that there are too few people who are starting companies. So I think that there should be many more people starting companies than there are today. But I also believe that most people shouldn't start companies. I don't think those are conflicting ideas, right? There are plenty of people who could start a company and could be successful with it who aren't today. But the majority of people, probably close to 90 to 95% of people, should not ever try starting a company. We're just far away from like that 5% of people who should actually giving it a shot. And then ultimately, it's like, I think that like starting a company could be a good, or at least like exploring starting a company could be a really good thing for you to actually show you that you shouldn't start a company, right? So as long as you don't go out there and you raise money and you make all these promises to people, it's pretty easy to wind down something, right? Like, you can go out there and you can work on shipping a product, you can get a few customers, you can find a co-founder. And then if you realize that, hey, like, after doing this for 3 to 6 months, I don't want to go and raise money. I actually do want to go get a job. And I think that's a great thing. Like, I think it's great for you to have tried it and realize that it's not for you, or at least not for you right now, because now you're going to go to that job and you're going to have so much conviction in that you're making the right decision to not start a company, that's actually really good. The worst thing that you could do in life, in my opinion, is to constantly be looking over your shoulder, wondering what if I had started that company? What if I had, done this thing the other way, right? And I think by sort of giving yourself the opportunity, it could be weeks, it could be months, to explore starting a company, it gives you that ability to actually feel pretty convinced that you're making the right decision, even if that decision isn't starting a company at all.
The people who really want to start the company, what should the ideation process for them read?
Everybody's got different opinions on this. And I don't think there actually is a one size fits all. I think that great ideas can come from, a couple of things. It can come from something that you already had before you decided to start a company. They could also come from the process of going out there and talking to customers and sort of like exploring and sort of having design partners. The people who build great companies can kind of like either start off with like, I have this idea that I already have and that I think is a good one because I would have been the customer for it, or I am the customer for it. Those are good ideas because if you're building for yourself, the only risk is that you could lie to yourself about whether or not you truly be your own customer. But, for the most part, if you actually were like going to be your own customer and you're not lying to yourself, like that's really good. So for instance, with ODF, frankly, over the last few years, I was less excited about the product that we were offering and the way we were building it. And I wasn't involved with running the product as much back then. And I feel like for me, when I came in and decided to, take the baton and become CEO, one thing that I really wanted to do with our products was build stuff that I'd be like super excited to use myself. If I were starting a company, or even if I wasn't starting a company, something I would really be excited about to use today. And for me, like part of that was sort of reevaluating kind of how we did things. And it was looking at sort of how we structured our program, making changes to that, structuring how we priced the program, and then also really evaluating how we think about our digital surface area as a business. Because we have these IRL cohorts, and then we have this like digital product that kind of ties it all together. And for me, it really came down to trying to build the product that I want to use. And I look at a lot of really great products and a lot of great founders, and they're really based off of that. And then ultimately, they realize that, if they only build for themselves, like that's not good. They need to build for other people too. So you have to start to take in other people's feedback as you go. But that's a really good way to kind of get started and build that progress or build that sort of initial product that you can make progress on and you continue to iterate on and improve over time. The other way is to kind of like have an interest in a space and then like spend a lot of time trying to understand what that problem is and understand how that problem works and really become empathetic and sort of an advocate for the customer. So for instance, there's a really great company called Lassie that's an OnDeck company, an ODF company, where the co-founders met through ODF. And, neither of them had a really significant amount of experience in private practice healthcare. One of them had worked a little bit in healthcare and a little bit in consumer fintech. And the other had worked in, had been an early team member at Superhuman, the email app. And ultimately, they realized that they wanted to work on something that was a really hard problem, that if they solved it, it would be really meaningful for their customers. And they felt like healthcare, and specifically healthcare sort of like back office work, was a really big challenge. And it was one that was making it harder for small practices to operate, so small medical practices. And instead of like, going and spending time on something that they already had sort of like an incredibly deep knowledge of, they instead just decided to find people that they could really spend significant amount of time with, learn from, and essentially start out by effectively doing consulting work for them. Like essentially they were taking over a lot of the functions of one of these healthcare practices and doing the work for them. And then eventually, if you're doing that, you start to really understand like the pain because you're actually doing it yourself. So you understand the pain. It's kind of like if you go and you work at a warehouse, you're going to understand the challenges around staffing at a warehouse, right? You're going to understand the challenges around coordinating people, right? Well, with healthcare, it's the same thing. If you're actually working in the system, you get to really have a good sense of where there are problems and where there are opportunities for improvement, and maybe even a sort of a way to prioritize the opportunities for improvement. So starting off by saying, hey, I'm really interested in this space, and then kind of embedding yourself in the space, that could be a place where you can really start to understand where the opportunities lie. And a lot of insights come from that.
Well, I think I'm the first part a little bit. If people or founders really build and are working on an idea that is extremely fun for them, how should they not get opinionated about what they are building in order to take feedback and build on it?
I think people should be extremely opinionated, actually. I think that the worst thing you can do is have a product that isn't opinionated. You should have a product that a lot of people actually don't like, because ultimately it's much better to have a product that people are very split on, right? Think about some of the best products, how some people really love them and other people really hate them, right? And granted, you don't want people to actually hate your product necessarily, but trying to sort of be like this average thing that appeals to everybody kind of means that you appeal to no one. I think a lot about how there's sort of this thing where people like, who's our target market? Our target market is everyone, right? It's like, well, like maybe, but you got to start somewhere, right? And usually it's good to start in almost a laughably small niche, right? Versus starting with something where we're building for everyone. Because there's something really special about when somebody discovers your product and it feels like it was custom built for just them, right? Imagine if somebody was listening to your podcast, for instance, and they felt like, wow, it feels like he built this podcast just for me, right? You kind of want people to feel that way versus like, oh, this is really highly generic. And it's like, it feels like a thing that like maybe, a lot of people would find vaguely interesting. It's like, this is part of what I do. I have a small publication called Text with Founders. And the idea with Text with Founders is for me to take actual text message conversations that I have with founders that I work with and expand upon them a little bit and write about sort of the things that I'm talking about with these other founders, these challenges that I'm helping them work through. And my dream for Text with Founders isn't to like have, tens of millions of downloads every month. It's for, a relatively small amount of founders to download the podcast or read the newsletter and say, gee, this feels like it was written just for me. Like this feels like it was something that I needed right now. And it solves like a real problem that I have. Or this is something that's super useful for me to know because I think it's going to be really valuable for me in the next couple of weeks or the next couple of months. And for me, that's like much more important than thinking about scale. Now, maybe eventually, I'm just spitballing here, but like maybe Text with Founders like ends up being something much bigger, and maybe there's like offshoots of it, right? Maybe it's like, we cover a lot more area, right? And maybe it's then for people who aren't just early stage founders, right? But right now, I think it's like way better to be really small. And then like, if you want to scale it, you can find adjacencies to move into, right? Maybe it's Text with angel investors next, right? Where I'm texting with people and we're talking about sort of how we evaluate companies. I'm just joking. Like, I'm not actually going to build that. But the idea is like, start with something that's like highly specific for a person versus trying to be too broad.
I mean, it's a good idea, the text with angel. How do you really define your TAM at the ideation?
Yeah, I don't think so I don't think that like you need to necessarily know what your TAM is in the early days, because I think it's a little bit of a shit test in the sense that what I mean by this is your TAM is either going to be outrageously large and obvious, right? So for instance, I don't know, let's say it's medical billing, right? Medical billing, really large TAM, right? In which case, like the actual like size of the market that you can get, sort of if you're successful, is some like small fraction of that huge market, right? And then on the other end of it, like, so that's one side of it where it's like absolutely obvious, right? that this is a massive TAM. So you don't even really just say it. The other side is that the TAM is laughably small, and it doesn't matter because either you're going to grow the TAM or you're going to move into adjacent markets, right? So, I think like a great example of this is like classic stuff like computers, right? It's like, well, the total market for like personal computers was really low, right? Like there weren't that many people who were buying personal computers. Most people didn't even necessarily think that they needed a personal computer. So I think that like in some ways it's not about the size of the TAM when you start. It's like, do you create the market? Do people like shift into that market? I think it's like usually a false question. And if people are like truly, and if investors are worried about TAM, like that's fine, because either they don't care about the opportunity, or they don't see that it could become big, in which case you're fighting an uphill battle because you can't convince them. Like Airbnb probably couldn't convince most investors that this is a big like opportunity and that they were going to both create a market and expand into adjacent markets, right? But ultimately I think it's really about like determining which side are you on. Are you on like the very small TAM that could potentially blow up and become massive, or are you on the already large TAM? If you're not on either of those, if it seems like a small TAM but that's not going to get bigger and there's no adjacencies, I think you're really screwed, at least as like a venture scale company. But I also can't think of many companies that have small TAMs that couldn't move into adjacent ones. I mean, I believe that like eBay started off as a product primarily for people to like sell their Beanie Babies or something. Like, and now that people sell their cars on eBay. So the question is like, what's the adjacency? Reddit even has, so many subreddits. It definitely didn't have that much in terms of content in the early days. So if you could move into adjacencies, that's great. The challenge becomes like, can you move into adjacencies?
Yeah, that's an incredible point. I think the last thing that you mentioned here about eBay, we didn't see as this very popular sort of speech that he gave, that if you have a smaller TAM, you are building something like a niche product, you have to first win that market in order to earn the right to do the next thing. Do you think that should be the case, or people should switch for one?
It's interesting. So essentially, let me play it back. You're saying that you need to like really soak up that small market before you should move to another market?
Yeah.
So, I think that that's probably true. The argument against it would be the question of whether or not moving into adjacent markets actually fuels each of the other markets. So for instance, if you were to move from, eBay is a good example. If you were to move from Beanie Babies to, baseball cards or something, then there's a chance that the people who start with the Beanie Babies also want to buy baseball cards or something like that. And that sort of just drives more platform activity. It probably also has a lot to do with like is it geo-specific, right? Like, is this IRL stuff happening on the marketplace, or is it sort of like it's less geo-specific in the sense that like anybody can bid on a product and in theory could get it sent anywhere in the world? So I think the answer is it depends. And I don't necessarily have a strong opinion. I could see the benefits of either of those. If you gun to head, you ask me which was more important, I would say focus is always more important. But I don't necessarily buy that sort of expanding to adjacencies could always be a net negative. There are a lot of positives associated with it too.
How you found to really build the focus for winning in a market? I mean, not deviate from one thing to another and spread their wings to, spread their tentacles to the two places? Or should people go?
Yeah, focus is really hard. Focus is hard because the more things that are going well for you, the more opportunities come your way. So essentially, and I think it helps to sort of map this to like personal career stuff too, like sort of how you think about your life. For the most part, you have like very few opportunities when you're young, and when you don't have a network, and when you have less experience, and maybe you have fewer legible achievements, right? Or less proof of work, right? So in those days, essentially any opportunity that comes your way, it makes a lot of sense to say yes to it, right? Because the upside is potentially uncapped. The downside is very limited. You have very little other things going on in your life for the most part, right? Then you start to get to a place where things are going really well. You start to have a reputation. You're going to start to get more and more opportunities. So it's going to be less like, oh, wow, every opportunity I should do because I have few opportunities. You're going to start to have more and more of them, right? And when you start to have more and more opportunities, you have to be pickier, right? And then I think like when you sort of hit the next phase, which is you have just like a ton of momentum on a certain thing, you really want to be even more careful about the things that you pick to focus on, right? Or adding new things to the bucket, right? So for instance, when I think about OnDeck, I think a lot about founders because, a lot of things that we've done in the past as a company were really good and made a lot of sense sort of in sort of isolation. But if you zoomed out, they didn't necessarily have the highest level of applicability for founders. And if I want to build the best place for more people to start the best companies, I need to really be focused on the founder like exclusively. So that's why I'm coming on your podcast. That's why I talk a lot about sort of the things that people have learned through the process of starting companies, the things that we've learned through building OnDeck. The reason I talk about all this is because I think it's valuable to share and to put out into the world so that people can understand, what it is that we do, what it is that we've learned, what it is that, why we do with the things that we do. But ultimately, I think it just comes down to like, is the thing that you're actually sort of contemplating doing, is that helpful? And how helpful is it? And what's the relative impact that it could have? And what's sort of the effort involved? So for instance, I think that like sometimes it's helpful when it's thinking about like product prioritization or sort of like feature prioritization. It's like, okay, well, what's the degree of impact that we think this could have, right? If we were to, implement it, right? What's our confidence level on it having that degree of impact? So like, do we think this is like a 10x improvement, but is our confidence level only about 20%, right? If it could be, right? Or is it 50%? Is it a coin flip that this is helpful? Or is it a 2x improvement, but we're 90% sure that this is going to have like a 2x improvement? 2x is pretty good, right? So and then it's like, then the other thing that you really want to look at is kind of like, what is the level of effort involved in it, right? Is this like a 2x improvement that we're pretty confident about, but it's going to take 2 years? Or is this like a thing that's like potentially really, really high, like return on investment in terms of time and all of that. But it's like, we have like 10% confidence, but this could take a day. And if it actually works, this is like an absolutely massive, like trajectory shifting thing for the company. If that's true, then it's worth sometimes taking a bet on something that is a day to get results on. And obviously these are all hypothetical numbers, but like, as long as something isn't a huge time investment and there's a potential for an asymmetric sort of return on investment, it's worth doing, right? That's why, it's an hour to do a podcast or whatever, hour and a half. There's asymmetric upside in doing podcasts. Or for me to come on a podcast, speak with someone who's, interested, who wants to tell stories about entrepreneurship. Like, this is really worth my time, because the chance that, like if one person sees this and joins ODF and starts an incredible company, that's an incredible thing, right? Like, it's not like I need 100 million people to see this podcast episode. I just need one person to see this and have it change their trajectory, and through them participating in ODF for it to be worthwhile. And if that doesn't happen, it's not the end of the world. It was only an hour.
That's a good point. I think if I pivot there a little bit, if we go back to the start of this point that you made, how should founders really go about building their network?
So I think that their network is a very ambiguous term. The way I would describe building your network is in a couple of areas. The first is that it's really helpful to know other people who are at the same stage as you. So for instance, it's really good to be deeply connected with, let's call it a handful to a dozen or more people who are really at the exact same stage of either figuring it out or they've just raised a seed. Having that sort of commonality about where you are as a team or as founders, really important. So I could talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to go through the categories before I do. The next thing is to have sort of a broader network of sort of loose affiliations that you can potentially engage with. These are people that you're not as close with as the half dozen or so other people, but they're people that you could help, that they could help you, that you can learn from, and they can learn from your experiences. And then the next thing is sort of like, how do you think about like how, if you're going to go and do the sort of traditional startup route, which involves raising funding, how do you think about fundraising, and how do you think about building sort of an investor network? So I'll start from the top. And I will say that like, while ODF can provide all of these things, I'm not here to say that ODF is the only way that you can accomplish these things. There are so many ways that you can go and you can start to know other people who are in tech. ODF, I think about, actually another person described this to me recently. They said, ODF 19, which was the cohort we wrapped late last year, they said, ODF 19 is really like, kind of like an ability to compress 6 months of valuable conversations into a week. So, and I thought that was really an interesting way of putting it, because you essentially gain a lot of insight and sort of like perspective on what you want to build and sort of how you might go about doing it in a very, very concentrated amount of time. And therefore, if it does save you 6 months of time, that's super, super valuable. But again, like in terms of how you build relationships and things like that, you can do it online. If you're not in a tech hub, you can do it through other things like university groups. There are other ways for sure to like build community. ODF is just sort of like that ability of compressing 6 months of valuable conversations into a week, and sort of all the relationships that come with those 6 months. So the first thing is sort of the founders. The reason you want to have these people around you is because you want to, one, learn from them, but also contribute back. And the reason you want this is because a lot of the stuff that you go through as a founder isn't specific to your company. It's very generalizable. So if you're building something in fintech and somebody else is building something in B2B SaaS, the challenges that you have are actually going to be like fairly common. There will be some niche things, but for the most part, hiring, sort of like talking to customers, like understanding what to build, how to prioritize what to build, how to work through like co-founder disputes. All of these things are just really like things that you just kind of want to have other people's insights and just both learn from them, be able to share your experiences with them. But then also, I think it's really important to just have other people who could be like, yeah, I empathize with that. That really sucks, right? Like a lot of people in your life will not understand at all what it is that you're going through as a founder. And in fact, like they probably will think it's kind of stupid. Why would you put yourself through this? Why would you feel so distressed? Why would you why would you spend all of this time on something? Like, it seems irrational, and in many ways it is. And ultimately, the way that you can get sort of through that is by having other people in your corner. It can be super lonely if you don't know other founders. So that's the first group. The second group is having like this broader network. This is why people go to university. This is why people do, ODF. This is why people do YC. The reason that people do this is because it's good to have some sort of affiliation that ties you together. This is also why people join sort of high growth startups. I don't think they realize it all the time, but the reason that people join high growth startups isn't just because it's a high growth startup. It's because the people that go to a high growth startup are people who might start startups in the future. And they're really good people to have in your network. So an alumni group from a high growth startup, like let's say Palantir or something, is going to be really valuable to be a part of. Similarly, being an ODF alum or being a Harvard alum or something, right? Or an MIT alum, like they're varying degrees here, but having this loose affiliation with hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of other people really does matter. There's somebody who did ODF 3 is much more likely to respond to a thoughtful email from somebody who did ODF 19 than somebody who they don't have any relationship to at all. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the right thing or the wrong thing. It's just the way it is, right? Humans have this connectivity with each other over loose affiliations. And I think that that's kind of a thing that you have to acknowledge and plan for. So having that broader network is really valuable. Again, it could be had in many different ways. And then ultimately, when it comes to fundraising, I think that like most people try to like build relationships with VCs early, like and have these like relationships with VCs before they go and fundraise. Generally speaking, I'm not a fan of it. I think it's a huge distraction. I think the way that you actually go and raise money is by not having these like long-standing relationships, which are really hard to actually make and have. What you should actually do is you should go focus on customers and then become an investable company. Like build things that are undeniably good, that people are excited to pay for, continue to grow. Like if you could tell a story of I'm growing 10% week over week, and this has been happening for 12 weeks so far, well, that's a pretty investable company. As long as somebody believes that there's an opportunity for this company, if it continues to grow, that will be a really, really sizable company in the future, either because the existing sort of TAM that they're going after is so large, or because they're creating a new market, or because they're going to be able to move into adjacent markets. But the worst thing you can do, in my opinion, is spend a lot of time talking to investors and all of that.
Is there a major difference from what you've seen of when people raise money with using the previous relationships they have built with the VCs versus when they build it as their fundraise?
Yeah, I mean, look, like there's really two types of people. They're the people who have like very long-standing relationships with VCs, and VCs will back them because they have a long-standing relationship. Either they were an executive at a startup that VC funded that they got to know through that investment, or they went to college with that VC, or they were a founder that the VC had previously invested in. If you're one of those people, and if you have any hesitation that you might not be one of those people, you aren't one of those people, right? Like it's very clear if you're one of those people. Most people aren't. That's fine. And in fact, I think that like in some ways those people actually have a disadvantage because capital is usually not the main challenge when it comes to building a business. When it comes to building a business, it is building something that people actually want and that they want so much that they're willing to pay for, or somebody's willing to pay for some part of it. And having capital does not actually solve for that. Having capital means that you can hire people and you can fuck off and spend a lot of money on stuff that's completely irrelevant. Obviously that's a bit of a joke because like, you can't actually use money towards discovering things and making insights, but it takes a surprisingly little amount of money to do that. I heard recently somebody say, it's amazing what somebody could accomplish with $500,000, and it's amazing how little other people can accomplish with $5 million. the reality is like the amount of money that you have is not necessarily correlated with anything related to your outcome. And in fact, it might be negatively correlated. The more money you have, the earlier on, the more likely it might just completely screw you. It could give you a false impression that you're actually making more progress or you're further along than you actually are. It could be like this false signal of validation. But the other side of that is that some businesses are very capital intensive. Like building an insurance company takes a long time and costs a lot of money. I was talking about Shepherd earlier. It took them about a year from the idea to like actually go out and like build and like have customers like onboarded. And that wasn't because they were slow. It was because this stuff moves slowly. Some of these processes of actually setting a business up like that. And, it's capital intensive. But once you actually have the business in place, it's much more of an execution risk than a market risk. Similarly, like drug development, slower, more capital intensive than building a B2B SaaS product.
When I go back to the networking point a little bit, the second point, the lose affiliation with people. The biggest problem is for early stage founders and for early stage people is they can only ask other people. They can't. They're not in a place to give anything to them in order to make it a fair trade or something that I say. How should people really go about making use of the network at an early stage when they do not have a lot of anything?
I think that people tend to underestimate what they're able to help with. I think that the best way that people can help is by giving feedback if they are a potential user of the product. Giving feedback on, hey, here's the stuff that resonates with me. Here's the stuff that is confusing to me. Here's the stuff that I really like about your product. Here's the stuff that I feel like could be improved. So if you're a potential customer of the product or you could use the product, like I think that the most helpful thing you could do, if you're trying to get a job, for instance, or you're just like want to help a company and sort of build a relationship, is say, hey, like I checked out your website. I really love what you're up to. Here's some things that like maybe, at least for me, thought like maybe it could be, improved. The other thing is like, if you're technical or you're an engineer, like helping people think through like technical challenges, right? Could be really good. I think the other thing is that just like being there for somebody is actually really important. Like a lot of people at ODF, they don't necessarily help each other in like this very concrete, like, oh, he helped me build X, right? Or she helped me do Y. It's literally like, oh, they were there for me to talk through this challenge I'm having with my co-founder at the moment, right? Like they didn't necessarily need to have an answer for it, but like the fact that I could talk to somebody, and they would be able to listen to me and they'd be able to be like, that sounds tough, right? Like, and like, I get where you're coming from, because I could imagine myself having that type of, conversation or that challenge with my co-founder or something like that. If somebody just says that, like it is just there and present and listening and is active, we call it like active listening. That is a huge, huge way to help somebody, and it costs nothing. It doesn't require a whole lot of experience or expertise. I think that the worst thing is that if somebody comes at you where you're having a challenge, and instead of just being an active listener and supporting them, instead like trying to inject opinions and ideas that maybe you don't actually feel that confident in, but you feel like you should say something. I think that that's the risk, is being prescriptive when you have no reason to be. So it's much better to just be an active listener, to be empathetic. Don't try to necessarily be like this person who's giving like very, very specific guidance, unless you have some real reason to be doing that. If is it good to get parenting advice from somebody who's never been a parent? Probably not, right? Like I don't have kids, so but like I would assume that the best type of parenting advice probably comes from firsthand experience of being a parent. Like you could probably read a bunch of books about it, but my guess is that that's not necessarily going to help too much. It might help a little bit, but you might actually get some like really like distorted advice, right? It's almost like, ChatGPT has its limits too, right? At least right now. It's like, like you're going to make a lot of mistakes as a parent. Like you're just not going to get it all right. I can tell you just from like hearing from my friends who are parents. But like, that's fine. Like that's totally part of it. You're going to make a lot of mistakes as a founder too.
I think that was incredible. But I think one question that I'd like to end with, I've been into startups and VC since I was 11. What do you think is one startup that's relevant you do?
About startups or something?
Anything.
About anything. Oh, wow. I think that I don't know if this necessarily will blow your mind, but I think that people far too often assume that the trajectory they're on is a given, and that it's like very hard to like go either to like it's very hard to like either like increase the slope or for the slope to decrease. I also think that people tend to believe that the slope that they're on is going to sustain. So like, let's say it's like going like this, and people can't, if people are just listening to the audio, I'm sort of like drawing with my hand, like a fairly like uphill slope. But it's not like super like straight up and to the right. And essentially people assume that it's kind of this rising slope. And the reality is probably closer to it being a slight decline. The reason I think it's a slight decline without additional effort on your part and sort of mindfulness is because the things that you know today are going to be irrelevant to the way we do things, 10 years from now and 20 years from now and 30 years from now. And the only way that you could possibly have the slope not be a declining slope is by continually learning and continually like being curious about the world around you and continually trying new things. And having like this openness to new ideas. So I think that like the way you go from like a downward slope to an upward slope is by having that level of openness and embracing new things. And I look at people who are very old, like people who are in their 70s or 80s, and I really see like two types of people. Those who fear sort of the present and the future, and those who think that the present is this really fascinating, amazing thing, and that the future could be even better. And if you look at that, you might be 11 years old, you might be 15 years old, you might be 33 years old like I am. You kind of have the opportunity every single day to wake up and determine how you want to think about the present and how you want to think about the future. You could imagine a present that you could view the present as a place where things aren't perfectly equitable. You could imagine the present where things are not great in terms of the climate. You could imagine the present as a place where there's barbarism, right? And there's violence, and there's disorder, and there's addiction, right? Or you could say, these are all solvable problems. And and in many ways, there are a lot of really impressive things and exciting things that are happening in the world today. And like, these are things that we should work on and acknowledge their challenges associated with them. But like, we have the ability to actually go and change the world. And by complaining or being sad about it, we deny ourselves the agency. And ultimately, I think that sort of the purpose in life, at least for me, is to be useful, and to feel like we actually have an ability to have an impact somewhere. And that doesn't need to be at this global level. Like, if you feel useful to your family, or if you feel useful to your local community, or you feel useful to a group of people, like that, and that satisfaction is good enough for you. Like, that's amazing. I don't want to rob people of the satisfaction or tell them that they need to have a certain way of thinking about their goals and their ambitions. But ultimately, it really comes down to, can you increase that slope? And do you want to increase that slope? I would say that a negative slope is just generally not a great place to be. But I don't necessarily think you need to go from like a fairly like, upward trending slope to one that's extremely steep, right? Like, I'm not saying that you need to do that, like that anybody needs to do that. I would advocate for everybody's slope to point uphill. But I don't necessarily think that you need to have the treadmill be one where it's like you're essentially running up like a massive hill the entirety of your life, if that's not what you like. Personally, I really like it, because I feel like that I like pushing myself as much as I can. I'm kind of a glutton for punishment in that regard, and like it's kind of where I feel most alive. But I'm not saying that everybody else should feel that way. But I do think that like pushing yourself towards that upward slope and being open and being excited about the future, being excited about the present, and embracing new ideas is probably one of the best things you can do for yourself. And I think it's like the thing that I'm most scared of is that young people don't necessarily feel that way, that it's cool to be a doomer. It's cool to say that like the climate is completely fucked and we can't do anything about it. It's cool to say that, like we can't solve problems. It's like that to me is one of the most devastating things. And I think it's probably the biggest risk, not just to any particular generation, but to humanity. And ultimately, I think that we're going to be able to pull back from it. But I think that the only way we pull back from it is by people being advocates, for the present and advocates for the future. So hopefully this podcast, that you do and sort of all of your endeavors and the people who listen to this, wherever they may be, hopefully they look at that and think about how can like I have an upward slope. How can I encourage other people to have that as well?
That blue 15-year-old me right there. I think, that I totally agree. I think the point, we becoming a diesel is not cool.
Totally.
I think this is incredible. You're one of the coolest people I've ever met there, I think. I think that's from my anything you'd like to say.
Go out there and do something that you're proud of. Push yourself to try and do things that, make you a little bit nervous. Like the risk of failing is relatively low. Ultimately, as long as you don't put yourself into a place where you're going to be in financial ruin that's impossible to recover from, you really have no reason to not go and try and pursue the things that you really care about. The opportunity is there, and there's just so much out there that needs fixing, that needs improvement, that needs people to come at it with like a fresh way of looking at the world. And ultimately, I hope that, I hear from people, in the years ahead, and maybe there are people who discovered ODF through this. Maybe there are people who, like got inspiration from the podcast episodes that you do. But I really hope to hear from people who, who pursued something that was meaningful to them. And again, that doesn't necessarily need to be something on this like global scale. But I hope that people go and do that, because I think that to me, is probably the best example of a life well lived.